All right, welcome. Today we're going to peel back the frost on a story you might think you know. We are diving into the surprising, pretty dramatic, and often contested history of the Winter Olympics, a global spectacle that, believe it or not, almost never even happened.
Okay, let's just jump right into this, because it's a wild paradox. The very nations that absolutely dominate sports like skiing and skating today, they were the biggest opponents of creating a global Winter Games. It's a classic story of tradition clashing with a new world order. So to really get why they were so against it, we've got to travel back in time, to the early 20th century. Back to a time when a totally different winter festival reigned supreme.
Yeah, before the Winter Olympics was even a thing, this was the main event, the Nordic Games. It was held in Sweden, and it was this huge, proud celebration of Scandinavian culture and their dominance in sports. It was their event on their home turf, and they were extremely protective of it.
And this, right here, lays out the whole conflict perfectly. On one side, you've got the Nordic Games. It's a cultural festival, all about protecting a very specific heritage. And on the other side, you have this new proposal for a truly global competition run by the International Olympic Committee. You can see why the Scandinavian countries looked at this new idea and saw it as a direct threat.
So you've got these winter sports powerhouses basically saying, no way, not happening. How on earth did the Winter Olympics ever get off the ground? Well, the answer is kind of funny. It basically snuck in through the back door.
And here's where the story gets a really great twist. The event we all now call the first ever Winter Olympics, well, it wasn't actually called that when it happened. It was just called an International Winter Sports Week, kind of tacked on to the Paris Summer Games. But it was such a massive success that 2 years later, the IOC looked back and said, you know what? That was it. That was the first one. They literally renamed it after the fact.
And that success was all built on this awesome lineup of sports that just totally captured the world's imagination. You know, things like bobsleigh and ice hockey proved that winter sports had this thrilling international appeal that went way beyond just its Scandinavian roots.
But, okay, so they got an official title. Problem solved, right? Not even close. For the next 7 decades, the Winter Games would face this massive identity crisis.
And here's the thing you've got to understand. For most of its life, the Winter Games never got the spotlight to itself. It was always tied to the gigantic Summer Olympics happening in the very same year.
And yeah, that created a huge problem. The Winter Games were always seen as the little sibling. They were kind of like the opening act for the main event, the Summer Games. And that made it incredibly hard to get dedicated audiences and, maybe even more importantly, the big advertising dollars.
So something had to change. And to fix this problem, the IOC made a decision that was, honestly, one of the biggest game changers in the history of sports.
The Games in Albertville, France would mark the end of an era. This was the last time the world would ever see a Winter and Summer Olympics in the same calendar year.
And then, get this, in a move that completely shattered 70 years of tradition, the Winter Games came roaring back just 2 years later in Lillehammer, Norway. This totally changed the Olympic cycle forever.
Yep, that created the only 2-year gap between Winter Games in history. And what did that do? Well, from that point on, the world's got an Olympic spectacle, either summer or winter, every 2 years. Pretty smart, right?
The result was absolutely transformative. I mean, finally free from the summer's massive shadow, the Winter Olympics just exploded in popularity. It finally had its own stage, its own dedicated audience, and its own place as a massive global event.
But, you know, just as they're hitting their stride, a new challenge pops up as we head toward the new millennium. Their audience was loyal, sure, but it was also getting older, and a new kid on the block was competing for younger eyeballs, the X Games.
So what does the IOC do? They adapt. In 1998, they made this huge move by adding snowboarding, a sport with deep counterculture roots, to directly target a younger crowd.
And they were just getting started. In 2002, they brought back the breathtakingly fast and frankly dangerous sport of skeleton, doubling down on those thrilling, high-adrenaline events.
This was a full-on strategy. They kept adding events like ski cross, slopestyle, and big air. Every single one was a direct and deliberate move to capture the energy and the vibe of the X Games, to make sure the Olympics stayed cool and exciting for a whole new generation.
So when you really step back and look at the whole story, the one constant for the Winter Olympics has been change. It had to fight just to exist. Then it had to fight for its own spotlight. And then it had to fight for a new generation of fans. It's a true underdog story of survival and adaptation, which leaves us with just one final question to think about.